The songs for Dark Desire were written between 2006 and 2007. By the end of 2007, we had recorded a basic demo of what the album would be. We'd refine the songs down to the 8 songs on the original album.
Oh no, because the bell goes over the string piece as well at the same time. Unless I leave the bell in the background and just play a string piece.
Depends which bit you play more of.
If I play a string piece, I can do the string there.
My voice is really going after that. Yeah.
Do you know what I'd say? It's time for the most important vampirist ingredient. Cups of tea!
Azrael started putting in more orchestral elements, refining the strings, adding in more brass and choirs and stuff like that. When working on the new version of the album, the easiest part should have been the keyboards, because most of those I had in perfect form, like the entire song all the way through each layer. Sometimes 5 different layers of strings, 2 choirs, 2 brass. There's a lot of layers on this album, and luckily I had all of those from the original sessions all as one contained file. So it should have been a case of just putting them into a new session in Pro Tools and then working the rest of the album around it. I realised that there was a heavy noise over all the keyboard tracks. I'm pretty sure there was a broken jack lead or something like that when we were transferring it from the Oasis in the first place onto the computer back in 2007 or 8, whenever we originally did that. So I spent a long time trying to EQ out all that hiss and noise. So eventually I gave up on that and decided to get rid of all of those original recordings, go back to the Oasis. Luckily, Azrael had kept all of those original sessions on there, so I just needed to re-record them off one after another. When we played Your Web live, Azrael would often change the verse melody to use strings instead of choir. Because of the way his keyboard was laid out at the time, it was just easier to do that, I suppose. And he changed the melody to be slightly different than it was on the album. So on this version, I've added that in on the second verse. It gives it a bit more dynamics. And there are a few new things throughout the album as well, like in A Dark Desire, I didn't want it to be too repetitive of like 3 verses all the same. So the second verse, there's a different drum fill based on what our drum used to do live. The first verse is more like the standard album version, and the third verse is completely different. I dropped out most of the instruments and had it as this kind of drop out, just nice clean bass sound, and everything then comes back in as the verse progresses and builds up to the end of the song. On the original version of the album, the drums were played by Azrael by hand when he wrote the demos for the songs. Kick, snare, maybe some toms on one layer, and then hi-hats and cymbals and stuff on the second layer, and that was basically it, 2 MIDI tracks. And then he'd give those to me, I'd take the MIDIs off of the keyboard, put them onto a computer, and I'd take his basic drum playing with his fingers and transfer that to sound more like a drummer, which I thought sounded good at the time, the drums you hear on the final album, but obviously listening back now it's very programmed.
Now we're gonna make love.
Oh yeah!
We decided to try and add a guitarist into the band for the first time in a couple of years. We mostly used keyboards throughout our entire musical history up until that point, so recording distorted guitars was quite different. So if you look at the folders, I've still got the original guitar tracks. It's not like one take of the entire song. It's like one note, one chord, 4 different versions of that we tried, and then move on to the next like note or chord. So you'd have to piece them together, which in the program we're using at the time, it looks quite sensible, like you've just comped a bunch of takes together. That's something we do all the time, but not when it's like one chord or like one chord's worth of riff. And the same was true for the vocals, although I was doing whole stanzas at a time or a whole verse, a whole chorus, so that wasn't so bad. But to know which one's actually used on the album is anyone's guess. It would be just like 4 different versions of a verse, and maybe a couple that are in half or a couple words that were comped in, the usual kind of stuff. But without that context of a session with all of it pasted into place, I have no idea which bits were which. We spent a very long time recording the album, and my vocals were actually pushed right until the end of the recording sessions. Essentially the main part of the vocals for the album were recorded in 1 or 2 days, 1 or 2 sessions, and I might have added a couple of bits here and there, like later on as we were mixing. So I was very unhappy with my performance anyway. We used a lot of trickery and noises to try and make it sound like something. In a way, listening back now, 10 years later, it kind of has a charm of its own. And the same with the guitars. There's quite a lot of reverb on the guitars even, and loads on the vocals. So we're covering up our mistakes, and it kind of gives it this really atmospheric sound. So I immediately knew that the guitars and the vocals for this new version of the album would need to be re-recorded from scratch. There are about 2 guitar parts from the original album that are used in this, and there's some distortion at the beginning and end of Your Web, which was loads of effects and a reverse like guitar chord noise, and that luckily we'd sampled that onto the Oasis for when we played live, and a similar thing on Nostalgia and the Cursed, the intro guitar piece. The only vocals we used for the new version was in Nostalgia and the Cursed. There's a scream at the beginning of the song. That again had been sampled onto the Oasis, so I didn't actually need to go through all those hundreds of files and find those parts. I'm really surprised how well the original 2009 version of the album sounds in the final master, because there was so much noise and hiss, and the timings were off. And because we had cut and pasted so many pieces together, back then we didn't know that you should add fades in and out of where you make a cut to stop being kind of digital noise being introduced. So I'm really surprised when you listen to it, you can't just hear clicks and pops every couple of seconds over the entire thing, because they're definitely there. So I give a lot of credit to the guy who mastered the album for somehow managing to sort that out.